LAIC just wrapped up the Latin America International Championships, a huge tournament, and notably the first Pokemon TCG tournament to feature Paradox Rift as a legal set to play. Now, I will say it did end up with a bunch of the stuff that you've already seen, right? You got stuff like Gardevoir in the top 8, top 16, top 32, top whatever. Lots of Gardevoir at this event is what I'm trying to say, but there was also tons of Lost Zone Box, Inteleon or Shifu, Mew was there, of course, and you had Charizard. Can't have a party without Charizard. All of the stuff that you're used to seeing did show up at this tournament. Hey, Miraidon even took the whole thing. Congratulations, Miraidon. Remember this video we did about how good Miraidon is and you should respect it? Here's more proof right there. But the actual point of this video is to show off 3 brand new decks from this format that we're not used to seeing and still did very well at this event. But first, of course, the creator call to action. You're never sick of hearing those. Make sure you sub to the sandwich if you haven't done it yet. We're still trying to get the channel off the ground. Now, I've wasted enough of your time. You came here to hear about decks, not for me to plead for you to subscribe to the channel. So let's go ahead and look at what we got to see over the weekend at LAIC, starting with the weirdest one first, and that is Cloth Electrode by Lucas Pedrosa in at number 85. I admit that when it first hits your ear, 85th place doesn't sound too amazing or anything, but then I give you the vital information that over 1,200 people entered this tournament, and you start thinking, hey, good job, Lucas. You actually did pretty good, especially considering you're the only person brave enough to bring a pile this ridiculous yet amazing to the event. In case you haven't seen Cloth Electrode yet, it mostly works off of Brute Bonnet's Pokemon ability, Toxic Powder. Once during your turn, if this Pokemon has an Ancient Booster Energy Capsule attached, you may make both active Pokemon poisoned. So, in case you don't know what Ancient Booster Energy Capsule is, it's a tool, and it's one of these. The ancient Pokemon this card's attached to gets plus 60 HP, recovers from all special conditions, and can't be affected by special conditions. Kind of interesting because if Brute Bonnet is in the active, you can just make your opponent's Pokemon poison, but it won't. The Brute Bonnet itself won't get poisoned. It's kind of cute, but mostly we're looking to bench this card starting on turn 1 and put either a Cloth or a Hisuian Electrode V into the active. Now, Cloth only needs double colorless for its attack, and it turns out that we're only playing 4 double turbo energy, the only energy in our entire deck, full play set of double turbo, so that we can Cloth on turn 1 if we can, if possible, right? But Cloth is just a 120 HP basic Pokemon that's a 1 prizer, which I think is kind of interesting. But if you do pop off this double colorless attack, it's Unhinged Scissors. It does 30 damage, plus if it's affected by a special condition, it does 160 more damage. So that's 190 damage. If you do have double turbo on, obviously, it's 170 damage, if you're doing the math correctly. But there's other stuff in this deck, like, say, Radiant Hisuian Sneasler, right? During your checkup, put 2 damage counters on the opponent's poison Pokemon. So if you're able to get this on your bench on turn 1, then just having Brute Bonnet with the Ancient Booster Energy Capsule plus Radiant Hisuian Sneasler, and you get an attack off with Cloth, you're actually going to do a lot of damage, enough to take out a whole bunch of V and EX and stuff like that. And even if you don't actually kill them one shot, then they're just going to single prize you if they can take out the Cloth next turn. They might not even be able to attack you next turn if you're able to do this quickly enough in the game, because if you go second, you just do this turn 1, like pretty easily, fairly consistently it looks like. If you don't put Cloth together, you do have Hisuian Electrode V, which does not need energy to attack. The attack just does 100 damage for each special condition affecting this Pokemon. So if it is poison, then it's going to do 100 damage, right? Plus another 10 damage during checkup. Plus if you have Radiant Hisuian Sneasler, that's extra damage during checkup. So that damage can add up fairly quickly too. And if they can't one-shot the Electrode V, it can usually two-shot them. So really, really sweet little deck here that does play a bunch of other stuff, like the Bidoof Bibarel as a 2/2 line to make sure it can get cards. Squawkabilly to make sure it can put together those important turn 1 bench states that it needs. That's pretty important to the deck too. Town Store is also in this deck to make sure that we can go get the Ancient Booster Energy Capsule when we need it, but there's also Spicy Seasoned Curry, a nice little piece in here that just burns our active Pokemon and then heals 40 damage from it. So this can be one of the most important cards in the entire deck. If Hisuian Electrode V has some damage on it from the last attack and it can't survive another attack, you can heal 40 damage from it and then burn it. If it's already poisoned, then its attack does 200 damage plus, the poison damage that your opponent's Pokemon will very likely suffer at the end of the turn. So you can get a lot of damage cooking up with the Spicy Season Curry and a Hisuian Electrode. Plus, if you don't have a Brute Bonnet in play, you can just burn your own Cloth and end up dealing a bunch of damage that way too. So cool little card to have in the deck. But let's move on to the second deck I want to look at today, which, in contrast to the last deck, is probably the best deck of the day, but this is my list, so the deck that I found coolest is definitely going to be number one. But I should bring up Entei Iron Valiant here by Noah Sawyer, because this was second place of the entire event and really made a good showing. Now, we've known that Iron Valiant was good from Japanese tournaments for a while now. You can also know the card is good simply by reading it. I don't think that it takes a genius to figure out there's a pretty good little Pokemon card here, but in case you haven't seen it yet, it's a 220 HP basic EX. Its retreat cost is 2, and it has this attack, Laser Blade, cost Psychic, Colorless, does 200 damage, but during your next turn, the Iron Valiant can attack. Once during your turn, this is its ability, Tachyon Bits. Once during your turn, when this Pokemon moves from your bench to the active, you may put 2 damage counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. Any of your opponent's Pokemon, bench or active, just throw 2 damage just because this moved from bench to active. That's actually ridiculous, and this deck plays an awful lot of cards that simply take advantage of this one ability. If you haven't noticed yet, there are 12 different switch effects that are obvious in the deck, right? We got Switch Cart, right? And obviously Iron Valiant's a basic, so that works. Escape Rope, that works. Switch, that works. So again, 12 different switch effects in this deck to make sure that you always have a way to make sure that Iron Valiant's putting 2 damage counters on something every single turn. Do note the deck also plays one very annoying copy of Medicham V, which completely break the game wide open. Over the course of a couple of turns, if you're able to use Iron Valiant's ability to put a couple of damage counters on, say, a Sableye, or something else with relatively low HP, and there's a ton of things in the format, whether it's a Ralts or a Kirlia for that matter, Charizard or Charmander rather, that hasn't been evolved yet. Ton of stuff, a Comfey for instance, there's a lot of Pokemon that fit the bill here, where over like 2 turns, you can put a couple of damage counters on them with Iron Valiant and then finish them with Medicham V. And then suddenly, you just get to take an extra turn and you probably win the game because of that. There's only one copy of Medicham, but it is very, very important to the deck's game plan. Aside from that, though, there's Radiant Charizard in here to help turn games around. You need at least one decent single prizer in the deck, and we're playing Fire Energy because we're playing Entei V, our other big attacker in the deck. But if you do get down on prize cards, Radiant Charizard can be really helpful, obviously. But Entei V is going to draw cards every turn, and even though there aren't a ton of Pokemon in our deck to bench, it's not too hard to keep a reasonably full bench. Another thing I like about Entei V in this deck is that it gets to leverage the higher HP of Entei V, right? It's got 230 as opposed to like Raikou's 220 and Suisun's, right? So this has relatively high HP, and as a result, as a consequence, it's always had a higher retreat cost than those other Pokemon that are like it. But this deck, because of all of its various switch effects, gets to effectively just ignore the higher retreat cost on Entei V. And I think that's cheeky and also very, very cool. But we've also got Squawkabilly in here just to finish off the Pokemon. Again, it's pretty important to set up correctly in the early game with this deck, so Billy is in here. Other cards I wanted to point out are the Jet Energy in the energy pile here, because this just gives us really 14 effects that can switch the Iron Valiant into the active, which is just hilarious. But there's also Magma Basin, which can not only remove Pat to the Peak, which I think is kind of very important for a deck like this, pretty obviously, but this can also just make sure that we can get, energy on our Entei, energy on our Radiant Charizard and all that. That's important, but again, I think the main purpose of this card in this deck is to remove Pat from the Peak when it happens. The other card I wanted to point out in here, though, is Technical Machine Devolution. Just a gross card to have. I'm surprised I didn't see more of these in decks over the weekend at LAIC. Just a gross card to have against basically Gardevoir, Chin-Pao, any deck that's going to revolve around or rely on Rare Candy, right? So, and there's a bunch of those decks in Standard right now. Charizard is one of them, Chin-Pao again, so at least 3 decks I can think of off the top of my head, and Gardevoir is one of the most played decks in the format too. That care about Rare Candy and play it as a 4 of most of the time, sometimes a 3. But Devolution is just so ridiculous against those decks that if you can resolve this spell, I'm a Magic player, sorry. If you resolve this card, you basically just win the game against those decks. So I wanted to point it out too. It's a teeth buster, but really sweet deck here. There's a reason it got second place. We should all be very scared of Iron Valiant. But the final deck that I wanted to look at today really combines all of my favorite things. An actual top 8 finish, first of all, so it's a relevant, actual competitive deck. Budget, it's only about $36 to play this deck. And finally, most importantly, Snorlax. Not only is one of the most successful decks that I've ever talked about on this channel a Snorlax deck, one of my very first videos, ended up getting a ton of views and a bunch of views specifically on the Cherry Snorlax deck that I did. So got a special place in my heart for that deck, but I've also just got a special place in my heart for Snorlax. Look at him, how can you not? He's just one of my favorite guys in all of everything, all fiction. So just love that this dude actually got some representation, and a Snorlax stall, they call it, deck is doing super well. This is not the only Snorlax deck at the tournament, by the way. A couple of these showed up, and they look very annoying and very neat. Not only to really add this to the qualifiers for things I like about a deck, not only is this all this stuff I've already called it, budget, competitive, Snorlax, whatever, but also sort of an alternate win condition. I tend to really like stuff like that that's not so straightforward. Plays the game in a different way. I think there's something to that. This deck plays no energy. Doesn't attack. It's just not going to attack the opponent. In 9 games out of 10, or really 10 games out of 10, or 100 games out of 100, I don't think this deck ever really plans on attacking. Now, to put everything into place, we're going to start with Snorlax here, obviously, 150 HP basic Pokemon, and as long as he's in the active spot, your opponent's Pokemon just can't retreat. The active Pokemon over there cannot retreat, so we're going to lock something into place. Now, we're also playing Mimikyu here, which I do think, I've seen some people say this isn't a great pick, but I actually think this is an amazing pick. I only play on the app. It's not like I'm a professional Pokemon player that plays a lot of paper games or anything like that against intensely good opponents. But I will say that on the app, Mimikyu has been the best card in multiple of my decks multiple times on more than just a few occasions. This can completely lock people out depending on what you're doing with your deck. And sometimes I just play a Mimikyu because I like Mimikyu. So maybe I'm a little biased here, but Mimikyu has got me out of a lot of jams on the app, and I really like the inclusion. And it just makes perfect sense in a deck like this. We're trying to keep your opponent from attacking or killing all your guys for as many turns as possible, so they draw as many cards as they can and eventually draw out. So Mimikyu makes sense to me. I think it's great. Now, Rotom V, again, you're not really looking to attack with these, but you might just draw 3 cards. Turns out your turn ends after you use the ability, but you weren't going to attack anyway, were you? So Rotom is really, really sweet. Pidgeot V is also in here, mostly because it can shuffle back into your deck along with any other attached cards and stuff, which is really sweet because you're just putting more cards in your deck in case you were going to deck yourself before your opponent. Now, there are 53 trainers in this deck. There are so many that I can't fit them all on the page. I actually have to scroll down to fit all of the trainers. That's amazing. It really is amazing. Turns out it was 7th place. I think I may have said 6th place. I thought it was 6th place, but good job. Either way, Keto. Very good finish. Top 8 with this deck is great. But let's kind of work our way down here, starting with the Arven that we're looking at right now. There's a lot of tools in this deck, but a lot of them are, or at least a few of them are one-ofs. So obviously a search tool like Arven makes a lot of sense. So, and there's a bunch of items in this deck that are also one of, so keep that in mind. You know, just Arven is a pretty obvious 4 because we are a toolbox deck. We want to search that toolbox for the one thing that we need for any given situation. This is kind of a control deck. I say kind of. This is literally a control deck, like to a T, down to the letter. And Arven is really good at finding certain things for certain situations, so definitely a playset there. Iona was a 3 of in this deck. There are going to be situations in the late game where we have like 7 cards or 8 cards in our hand, right? And, you know, we may draw basically all of our prize, you know, not all our prize cards, but we might draw 6 cards, right? But we're still putting more back than we're taking out. So again, it'll keep us from decking ourselves. And if we can catch our opponent in just the right spot where, you know, they still have like 4 prize cards left, they have no cards in their hand, they draw 4, that actually kind of counts as us milling them. I know it's a magic term, but I think a lot of you know it. You know, we're basically milling them cards if we can get them to draw extra cards with an Iono. So cool beans there. But there's also Penny, a 3 of in this deck. Basically, if Snorlax has too much damage on it, we can pick it up. It also picks up the tools that are on a card as well, and that's pretty impactful in this deck thanks to a tool or two that we are playing. But, you know, say that we're playing Snorlax with the cape that we'll look at in a minute that gives it a plus 100 HP. Well, that means it's going to take a few hits for your opponent to actually knock out your Snorlax. That's totally cool. You just play Penny, get your Snorlax and the cape back in your hand, reset it onto the table, and it's going to take your opponent another couple of turns to finish it. So it makes sense that Penny's in here. Misfortune Sisters, baby. This is really good against basically any deck that's playing a lot of items, but I'm fairly certain any mill deck, stall deck, deck your opponent deck is going to play some number of Misfortune Sisters. It just makes sense because it counts as like 2 or 3 mills on average when you play it. So obviously you're trying to run them out of cards. You play Misfortune Sisters. Erica's Invitation, really, really important for this kind of deck here. Because even though we're not really looking to attack very often, we can just force a basic, an inconsequential basic with no energy on it, into their active slot. And that again is very important for just stalling the game out. You know, every card they draw really, really counts, and every turn that they can't do anything really counts. So just making them sort of change their game plan. Mostly this deck is all the different ways we can interact with an opponent in one deck. And that's one of the things I like about it. Avery's in here too, just to shrink benches. There's a lot of reasons to do that, especially with Miraidon being so popular, but a lot of other decks too. Peonia, if key cards show up in our prize cards, we can get them. Sydney is in here to get rid of any important tool cards or energy cards. Again, we're just looking to interact with our opponent, throw them off their game plan so that we can get more turns in. Giacomo is in here. There is a lot of special energy in Standard right now, so one of Giacomo makes sense. Even a Silene is in here. Makes perfect sense. If you can win the flips, you actually get a fair amount of value off this. Team Yells Cheer is in here. You know, this shuffles cards back into the deck, which is usually the maligned part of this card. You want to draw the cards as opposed to shuffling them into your deck. But in this deck, you want those cards in your deck because all you're trying to do is not run out of cards. So Yells Cheer makes sense. Pokegear, a full playset in here to find those important supporters. Nest Ball, full playset to find the Snorlaxes and whatnot. Counter Catcher in here. You're almost always going to have more prize counters or cards remaining than your opponent because you don't take prize cards. This is just basically 4 more copies of Boss's Orders. We're already running 2, but we don't need to run a full 4 up Bosses because we have Counter Catcher as a playset in here. Just a disgusting card. Switch card obviously helps save our Pokemon. Pal Pad to get the supporters back into our deck. Again, card that does that. A single Battle VIP pass. You don't see that every day. An Ultra Ball in here. We can discard the Battle VIP pass to that later on in the game, a lot of the time. Hisuian Heavy Ball to rescue Snorlaxes from the prizes. Echoing Horn in here. Again, you don't see it every day, but you put a basic Pokemon for your opponent's discard pile onto their bench. You can switch it with the Boss's Orders. You do see it sometimes in like Lost Zone Box and stuff like that. Other decks occasionally will play Horn. But there's also Super Rod to, again, shuffle cards back into our deck. Bravery Charm to make the Snorlaxes bigger. Luxurious Cape is the card that I was talking about just a second ago that gives our basic Pokemon plus 100 HP if it doesn't have a rule box. That's what it is. If it doesn't have a rule box, our Snorlax gets plus 100 HP. So the idea here is that we can use Arven and Pokegear and stuff like that. Well, does Pokegear do it? Supporter card, no. But yeah, we can use Arven and stuff to go find the one copy of Cape that we have, attach it to Snorlax. We have 250 HP Pokemon. We can penny it back to our hand. Pretty disgusting stuff there. And then finally, Temple of Sinnoh is in the deck because we don't play energy. So if opponent is on, you know, a plan that involves special energy, which there are obviously a few important decks in Standard, whether it's Inteleon Shifu or maybe Mew or whatever that cares about special energy, then suddenly you're just going to totally cheese them. So ridiculous, complicated control deck here with 53 trainers in it, and I just love every single thing about it. In case you want to check these decks out without having to watch this video all over again, I'll leave a link to Limitless TCG down there in the description of this video so you can check out not only these 3 decks, but all the decks that placed at LAIC, including that sweet first place Miraidon deck and a bunch of other stuff too. So check out the description for that and other kind of links to other videos that we've done. I know it's been a few weeks since we did anything on the channel, but I haven't abandoned the channel, not at all. I just wanted some stuff to happen in Paradox Rift Standard. So now that it has, I'm actually really excited. You know, we got some brand new decks out of this format, and we even got some older decks that are adjusting with some brand new cards, and maybe we'll talk about that in a future video too. I'm still excited about the world of Pokemon, do not get me wrong, and especially when cards this broken are coming out, like, yeah, Absolutely. So really, really sweet set here, and there's a lot to talk about with it in the coming days. So just make sure you stick with the channel. Again, subscribe to the sandwich if you haven't done that just yet. We're trying to get to 100,000 subscribers, and we just hit 1,000 last month. So really a pretty high goal there, but I think we can make it, you and I together, hand in hand. Just keep checking back with the channel if you're not subscribed. I just like that you're here for the content. But that's basically all I've got for now. Just let me know how you felt about all the goings on, your favorite decks from LAIC over the weekend, and I will catch you cats later. I'm Deb from the place. Thanks for watching, y'all. Spread love and be kind.